Hey, so you know that I know that you don't want to miss any episodes of 10 Minute Murder, and you want them the moment they're released. The best way to make that happen is to follow in whatever app you're listening right now. Depending on the app, it might say follow or subscribe or collect. Just hit that button and be the first to get new episodes.
10 Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10 Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10 Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. I'm Joe, the host, and thanks for being here. And thank you to everyone sending in your stories to 10minutemurder@gmail.com. You all seem to find some of the most interesting cases, and many times, the stories I've never even heard of. When I first started doing this podcast, I was finding the story ideas for myself, which is fine, but I later thought maybe I should be listening to the people actually listening to this podcast to know what is interesting to them. And by them, I mean you. I want to make it as interesting as possible for you, and I can't do that if the stories suck. So, if you have one of those interesting stories, please send it to me, 10minutemurder@gmail.com. Otherwise, I'm going to be doing episodes that are only interesting to me, and that's going to eventually lead to me doing a gigantic episode on O.J. Simpson. That might happen anyway. I don't know. The story we're talking about today, I accidentally did a little more research on than normal. And most of that is not going to make it into this episode because only a small portion of it pertains to the actual case, and this podcast is only, give or take, 10 minutes long. I started down a rabbit hole of the history of murder in the name of religion. I read articles about the psychology of it, if it biblically checks out, it doesn't, and what religious leaders have had to say about it. Specifically, the Pope weighed in on the subject. He said, "No one must use the name of God to commit violence. To kill in the name of God is a grave sacrilege. To discriminate in the name of God is inhuman." This is in direct opposition to the beliefs of Paul Jennings Hill. He was an anti-abortion extremist that murdered a doctor and his bodyguard in the name of his religion. Before we get going with the story, let me say that I will not be discussing or giving my opinion on abortion. Obviously, I have an opinion, but that's not what this podcast is for. We all have opinions and beliefs. We might disagree. However, I respect your right to have them. Paul Jennings Hill was from South Florida, raised in Coral Gables. At age 17, he had a drug problem, and when his father insisted he get treatment, Paul was arrested for an assault on his father. He was sent to a military school, and 2 years later, said he experienced a religious conversion. He met his future wife, Karen, at Belhaven University. They later had 3 children together. Paul Hill graduated from Reformed Theological Seminary, where he studied under Greg Bahnsen, a founder of the right-wing Christian Reconstructionist movement. Christian Reconstructionism is a movement that believes in the restoration of certain biblical laws that include the death penalty for not only murder, but propagators of idolatry, open homosexuals, adulterers, practitioners of witchcraft, and blasphemers. They literally believe that if you cheat on your spouse or are gay, you should be killed by law. Following his ordination in 1984, Paul Hill became a minister affiliated with the Presbyterian Church and Orthodox Presbyterian Church. In 1993, following a number of televised appearances by Paul, speaking as the self-appointed national spokesman for defensive action against abortion providers and claimed a connection to the Army of God, he was excommunicated by the church. If Army of God sounds familiar but you can't quite put your finger on where you've heard it before, listen to a previous episode of 10 Minute Murder about Eric Robert Rudolph, the Olympic Park and abortion clinic bomber. He was a member of the Army of God. On July 29, 1994, Paul Hill carried a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun as he approached the Ladies Center, an abortion clinic in Pensacola, Florida. Dr. John Britton and his bodyguard, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel James Barrett, were outside with Barrett's wife. Paul Hill moved in close and fired on them. Dr. Britton and Lieutenant Colonel Barrett were killed. Mrs. Barrett was wounded, but she survived. Paul Hill put the shotgun on the ground and waited for police. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, and also 1 count of firing into an occupied vehicle. Representing himself in court, he pled not guilty on all counts. According to Paul Hill, his actions were a defensive act rather than a retribution. On December 6, 1994, Hill was found guilty of the charges and was sentenced to death. His petitions and appeals were denied. The execution warrant was signed in July 2003 by Governor Jeb Bush. Hill died by lethal injection on September 3, 2003. 1 day prior to his execution, he gave an interview, and here is a portion of that.
The obvious question, hearkening back to 9 years ago, is why did you do it?
Perhaps the most fundamental reason is the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder, also requires the means necessary to defend innocent people, and that's what I did, was I used the means necessary to defend innocent people. I compare my actions in my mind to the shootings at the Columbine High School. If I had killed one of the murderers there at the Columbine High School, people would not have objected to my actions, because I would have been saving born children that were grown up. If someone were standing on a playground with a rifle shooting children on the playground, it would be your duty to come up and use the means necessary to stop him. And that's similar to what I did. I used the means necessary to restrain this abortionist. I believe that the force that I used was reasonable, because if I just wounded him, it's highly probable that he would return to killing innocent children. They'll say, well, you acted as judge and jury and executioner, and I said, no, I wasn't acting in the capacity of civil justice. I was acting as an individual, and individuals can defend their own children without the permission of the government. You don't need anyone. It's an inalienable duty to defend innocent people from being murdered.
How can you reconcile being a Christian and being pro-life with what people call 2 murders?
Murder is unjust killing, whereas killing a murderer under many circumstances is justified. So I disagree with those who say that what I did was murder, and I say that I prevented murder.
I know that you've stated very clearly you are not only resigned to this execution, but that you feel honored because of the reason for it, but is your execution, is it just?
No, they're executing me for doing a good deed, and it's certainly an honor for me, but it's an egregious sin for the government to put not only someone who defended innocent life to death. I mean, it would have been bad. I would have deserved to be here under these circumstances if I had been an abortionist, or if I had even been an accessory to an abortion.
What are you going to say to your family? Have you thought about it?
What am I going to say to my family during the last visit? We'll probably try and keep it light and keep smiling and not say things that would evoke deep emotions and tears and that kind of thing.
Your execution, as you're well aware, is scheduled for 6 o'clock tomorrow.
Right.
Are you looking back and looking forward? Are you at peace right now with yourself and what you did?
Oh yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, if I had to do it again, if I were put in similar circumstances, I would act similarly. No, I don't look back and wish I had done anything differently. I look back and I stand amazed that God gave me the privilege of acting as I did, and that what I attempted to do was accomplished as it was. And so I look back and I'm thankful that the Lord gave me the opportunity to stand for this principle and to effectively use the means necessary to defend innocent people. Well, it was definitely unpleasant to have to kill 2 human beings made in the image of God. It's not something that anyone should take lightly. But it's also a great joy and a privilege to defend human beings that are made in the image of God and save human life.
That's today's 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast. Hey, thanks for listening today, and don't forget what I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. If you'd like for me to read one of your submitted stories on this podcast, you can email it to 10minutemurder@gmail.com. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you are listening right now and never miss another episode. And if you have friends that are into brief true crime stories like this, tell them about 10 Minute Murder. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.